So in this video, we're going to be talking about Alexander the Great and maybe get at a little bit of what was so great about him. With the death of Philip, Macedon is left at a very vulnerable point. Its expansions into Greece in the south and into Europe in the north, and most of all, Philip's plans for the East and for the Persian Empire are left in question, and Macedon is left in a very vulnerable place. There are, many people in Greece who see this as an opportunity to restore Greek independence and to throw off the Macedonians. And so, the accession of Alexander comes at an absolutely crucial point. Alexander must be, from the moment of his becoming king, everything that Philip was. And the thing about Alexander is that he quickly develops the reputation for being far more than Philip had ever been. The Philip is represented as the prototypical king of Macedon. But from the beginning, Alexander is larger than life in a very new kind of way. Usually, when you have a figure that is represented as being sort of a greater man than everyone else, is a larger than life kind of character, it's because he's stronger. It's because he's more of a giant in the Goliath kind of sense. Alexander is something else. He has the attributes of a Heracles, but not just in the strength of Heracles and the ability to perform great feats, but in the semi-divine nature, the sense that he is not just a mortal man. This is we're not talking about his reputation in history. We're talking about his ability to gather people to himself, to inspire, to ensure the enthusiastic loyalty of people and troops and foreign subjects, and everything about Alexander plays into not just his standing as a preeminent military figure, but the fact that he is both a great ruler and personally something more than a common man, that he possesses unnatural beauty, that he evokes the ideal, is part of the clue to understanding his appeal. And so, the Alexander that we know comes to us through imagery. Philip, we have only a few images for. Alexander, there are scads, some of them famous, and not too far from being contemporary. So, for example, we have this image of Alexander that comes from a mosaic in Pompeii, and this represents him as he was often depicted, with the famous armor that he had and with his horse Bucephalus and so forth, and in the midst of battle as a person that stands out, even in a throng on a battlefield, even amidst thousands and thousands of troops and enemies. Alexander seems to radiate something. And again, we're talking about the reputation that he had at the time, his ability to accomplish so much in such a short period of time. And so, the military depictions here, we see him with the lion's head, depicting both strength and bravery, as with Hercules and other characters. But his physical representations, the imagery that we have of him, both ancient and modern, is very much in line with the Greek ideal. of a man as symbolized by an idealized male form. And so the imagery that we have of Alexander has everything to do with how he is more than just a king of Macedon, and more than just a general, that he represents some kind of paragon, that he combines both the raw potency that comes from his barbarian roots and everything that is contained in the potential of the Greek. The sense that he is the future of both Macedon and the world of the Greeks. And this helps to explain his appeal both within, Macedon and within the Greek world, that he represented the next stage for Macedon, even to its most tradition-bound inhabitants. Somebody like Alexander would be able to accomplish so much more for Macedon than anyone who was an ordinary Macedonian king, even Philip. And of course, Philip dying when he did was seen in retrospect as presenting the foundations for Alexander to accomplish so many great things. And so, the depictions of him, his physical beauty are representations of the way in which Alexander was seen as almost a kind of evolution, as a bringing together both everything that was that came from the strong raw power of a king of Macedon, and the something else, the ideal man that the Greeks had always striven for. Even in portraits that are very close to being contemporary, we are able to see this being deliberately invoked by the artists involved. In everything from the expression, the cast of his face and cheekbones, the lips, the flowing hair. This is all part of something that is very masculine in a Greek way. In other words, it's not about the barbarian brute. This is about the refinement of everything that the Greeks have striven for in contesting with each other. Yes, athletic ability. Yes, physical, muscular talent. But the mind and the soul is as expressed in physical beauty. And every kind of artist, from ancient to the modern, has attempted to encapsulate this. This is a Warhol depiction of Alexander the Great, and of course we've had some less successful depictions in modern years, such as the terrible movie Alexander, and you might not know about this, but even William Shatner played Alexander in a pilot that was made the year before Star Trek went on the air. But ultimately, Alexander is as much about the idea and the imagery and what that imagery represents in the hopes and excitement of what they hoped Alexander would be able to accomplish. And Alexander was able to prove them right. From the very beginning, Alexander is taught to be both Macedonian and Greek. He is raised as the son of Philip, and is immersed in the ways of the traditions of Macedon. He's also raised as the son of Olympias, and so her own traditions coming from a different tribe, and with her sense of ambition and destiny for Alexander. Both Philip and Olympias have a profound sense of ambition for Alexander, which is expressed in very different ways and expressed sort of separately, since Philip had multiple wives and multiple commitments to all the different tribal peoples of Macedon. But Alexander is also raised in an increasingly Hellenized Macedon, a Macedon that is more and more engaged with the Greek world, that is imbibing Greek culture, the Greek language, the Greek traditions, and Greek ideals. The striving toward an ideal society. And so, the fact that Alexander is taught by Aristotle is just the beginning of this. Alexander internalizes the Greek idea, the push for arete, the struggle to achieve beyond what you are as a person and as a culture. And so, he undertakes this in everything that he does. His goal for dealing with the relationship with Macedon and Greece is for them to come together in and combine all of the strengths that each culture has. This is even more true when he turns to the east. Alexander's ultimate intent with regard to the Persian Empire is not merely to remove a threat to the Aegean world, not merely to exact revenge for Persia's invasion of the Aegean world in 490 and 480. He hopes to accomplish something by this conquest, to create a melding, a fusion, a synthesis of everything that is great about the Greek culture and everything that is great about the ancient civilizations of the East. The Greeks know that they came later, that the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt are far older and richer and cultivated so much more in the path of civilization, have accomplished a much longer journey, and Alexander admires the Greeks for their ideals and for their principles and for their philosophy, and he admires the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians for the level of culture, the level of civilization, the depth of culture that they have achieved. And Alexander sees as the greatest possible accomplishment the bringing together of all of that greatness between the Greeks and the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, and to fashion the ultimate culture. Alexander also expresses his Greekness by having a protege, Hephaestion, who is, both his intimate in an erotic sense, in a carnal sense, but also, his intent is for as Achilles had Patroclus, so Alexander has Hephaestion, the idea of having a younger protege who can be his successor, whom Alexander can pass his accomplishments, his arete onto. And of course, the tragedy of this, the irony or whatever, is that Hephaestion, like Patroclus, dies before his patron, and leaves Alexander bereft with grief for the loss of his legacy. So what does Alexander do? He conquers the East. He conquers the Persian Empire. So this is accomplished in a series of stages, but it is an enormous achievement in retrospect. It seems impossible that Alexander should be able to become the conqueror of all this territory. Part of this is, needs to be understood via the fact that a great deal of this was already ruled over by Persia. So by defeating Darius III and taking over the Persian Empire, Alexander is also able to engage in immense conquest. But Alexander doesn't just defeat the Persian armies at Issus, at Gaugamela. He undertakes a massive expedition to the east, and his sights are not limited by the Persian Empire. He goes far into new territories in Bactria, and even into India. The goal would have been to merge into the great civilizations of the Mediterranean world, the great civilizations of India, which Alexander was aware of, had heard about through Herodotus and other more recent sources, and saw as being just the beginning of bringing together all of the great cultures of mankind. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to convince his army to go along with that. He wasn't able to go so far as to conquer India. India is a completely different world from the Mediterranean world, uh, just in terms of geography and in terms of climate, in terms of the disease gradient. It's something that's would have been would have required a miracle to bring together with the Western world, something that even the Mongols weren't able to accomplish 1,500 years later. So the key events in Alexander's at the beginning of Alexander's reign. So he comes to the throne. He has to take charge. He has to present himself as the king, not just as Alexander's pretty son, but as somebody who's capable of ruling. One of the ways in which he is able to demonstrate this is the retaliation against Thebes. Thebes sees its moment, takes its chance, and renounces the rule of Macedon, and in order to demonstrate the power of Macedon, Alexander marches on Thebes and breaks down its walls and essentially destroys the city. And this is all that Alexander really has to do to show that he is just as much of an overlord as his father. After Thebes, he's able to turn his attention to the east. And so the first stage of this is entering into the Persian Empire. One of the things about the Persian Empire, of course, is that the Persian Empire is successful because the people of the Persian Empire want to be ruled by the Persians. One of the reasons that this is so is that the Persians try as hard as possible not to be oppressive. And they do this by leaving the rule of their territories to their satraps as much as possible. They have a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that the satraps don't become corrupt and oppressive. And they don't have a lot of standing armies. They don't have a huge Persian army that's sitting around waiting for invaders. The number of soldiers that the Persian Empire has under arms at any given time is only what is necessary to deal with any internal insurrections. The Persian Empire had expanded to its natural borders, and so its frontiers, generally speaking, weren't didn't have to be defended by troops. They were defended by mountains and deserts. So the point of this is, when Alexander enters into the Persian Empire, he's not fighting against the might of the Persian Empire. He's fighting against the ability of the satraps of Western Anatolia to defend against the massive army that Alexander is bringing with him. And so, his ability to take control of Anatolia, this gives him a foothold from which to be able to consolidate his position and set up a supply chain to gather his forces to be able to fight against the king of Persia himself, who hastily assembles as big an army as possible from his subjects, from mercenaries and so forth. But these are armies that are not extremely well trained. These are not armies that have except for the elite fighting force at the top of the Persian army, the immortals, the vast majority of the Persian army is more or less thrown together, and they're fighting against the extremely well trained and extremely well equipped Macedonian hoplite army of Alexander. And so, that said, the Battle of Issus might have gone either way, simply because of the numbers that Darius is able to bring to bear. But ultimately, the fact that Darius loses his nerve and flees is one of the things that turns the Battle of Issus in favor of Alexander's much more disciplined troops. From this point, Alexander, makes the tactical move not to march eastward to Babylon and Susa and Persepolis, but to take control of the coast and to make sure that he isn't attacked from behind or that he has any naval problems to deal with. This takes him in the direction of Egypt, and he goes to Egypt and essentially takes over there. What this really means is that Egypt was only very lightly controlled by the Persians to begin with, and like the Persians, Alexander agrees to, let Egypt, sort of fend for itself. But Alexander is able to win the confidence of the Egyptians, through his personal presence and through stories that are told about how he's actually semi-divine, which is one of the things that sort of helps with in terms of Egypt. The Egyptians have, the tradition in Egypt, of course, is that the pharaoh is a manifestation of the gods. The Persians had never really gone in for that. Their viceroy in Egypt, had never really tried to declare himself to be a god or anything like that. And so, the Egyptians were very aware of being under foreign rule. But if they could convince themselves that Alexander was semi-divine, that his father was Zeus Ammon, then maybe this was one of the things that makes rule by the Macedonians more palatable to the Egyptians. But more practically, wherever Alexander goes, he invests in the places that he becomes the ruler of. Over time, he devotes a great deal of energy to Egypt, as to all of his other domains. He creates cities there that are not just centers of population. That become centers of new commercial practices and become centers of learning as well. Alexandria in Egypt becomes one of the most famous cities of the ancient world as a center of culture and learning as much as anything else. Finally, he turns east to Babylon and to the Persian capitals. It's interesting the different treatment that he gives for each of these. So he embraces Babylon because Babylon is not a Persian city. Babylon is much older. Babylon is the embodiment of the culture of the civilization that the Mesopotamians achieved, going back to the Bronze Age. And so, Babylon is the place that Alexander enters into in triumph and makes his own, makes the seat of his rule over these new domains as king of Asia. And a symbol of the synthesis that he's trying to bring about between East and West, between the Greek and the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian. Whereas the Persian capital Persepolis is a monument to Persian rule, and so he ends up he destroys Persepolis because he needs to literally and symbolically destroy the rule of the Persian Empire so that it can, so that everyone knows that he has replaced it. But he doesn't rest on his laurels. He marches further east, and his accomplishments in the east beyond Mesopotamia should not be ignored. Bactria, for example, what is now Afghanistan, becomes a center of intercultural exchange of Greek learning and Asian tradition and the combination of that for centuries afterwards. And Bactria becomes this cultural bastion in the middle of southern Asia. He takes his armies as far as the Indus, and the Battle of the Hydaspes is sort of the turning point. It's the demonstration that Alexander will not be able to plow through India the way that he had in Persia. And this is not just because his troops begin to resist. This endless march into the east. But rather that this. There's something very clear about the Battle of the Hydaspes and his march into India that this is beyond what he's capable of doing now without first very firmly consolidating his throne in Babylon. And so they return to the Indus and eventually march back to Babylon with a great deal of casualties. And Alexander is left to consolidate his rule and to plan the future of bringing together these great cultures. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. For now, that's that.